Hello from Freedomtax Accounting. We're an accounting firm here in Florida where we have been providing quality tax and accounting services for more than 20 years now. Even though we are in Florida, we are authorized by the federal government to represent individuals and businesses in front of the IRS in all 50 US states. We are going to make a detailed video today about one of the most common questions we get here in our firm, and it is, what can I use the EIDL loan for? There's a lot of questions surrounding this topic, and we felt it was good to really do a video in detail on how to use the funds, because there are many rules and restrictions. And even though the EIDL program has a lot of rules and restrictions, it is a very good commercial loan. It is really a good loan to get to keep your business going during this pandemic. But it's important to know that you cannot just use the funds for whatever you want, because you can really get into trouble in the future with the federal government. So we're going to go in detail in this topic. And we are recording this video on July 7th. And I always emphasize the date of the recording of these videos, because if you have been keeping up with the information about these programs, either EIDL or PPP, you know that these programs have been constantly changing. So that's why it is important that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. We will always do our best to upload videos with the latest information. So subscribe to our channel so you always have the most current and accurate information, because today is July 7th and things can change as soon as tomorrow. That's the way it's been for the last couple of months with these programs. So let's go into the topic. So it is important to remember that the EIDL program has two parts. The first part is the EIDL grant, which it's $1,000 per employee up to $10,000. A lot of independent contractors will only get $1,000. And there's also the EIDL loan. There are two separate parts to the EIDL program. Now, the same spending rules apply for both parts. And this is very important, because a lot of people think that the spending rules only apply to the loan, and that is not the case. They also apply for the grant. A lot of people think that they receive the grant and they can use it for whatever they want, and that is not the case. The same spending rules apply for both. The only difference is that you do not have to pay back the EIDL grant. You only have to pay back the EIDL loan, okay? Now, when people ask the questions, what can I use my EIDL funds for? Any good CPA or attorney will always answer the following: it depends. Why? Because every case is different. Every case, every business has its own specific details that may affect the way we answer that question. That's why we always try to get more information from our clients in order to advise properly. So it is always good that, even though that you are seeing this video, and we will provide the general guidelines, we will provide examples in detail, but it is always good to consult with your attorney and with your CPA for your specific case. Now, I always emphasize when we're giving out the consultations that these rules are made by the SBA. We did not make the rules. And I specify that because we're seeing that once we tell business owners what they can use these funds for, and especially what they cannot use the funds for, they get mad, and they get mad at us. And I always tell them, look, we did not make the rules. These are SBA rules. Our job is to provide accurate information in order for you do not get into trouble with the federal government, okay? Now, I always try to remind our clients that even though there are many rules in this program, it is a very good business loan. So if you think it'll help your business keep running, during this pandemic, it is a very good business loan to get, but you just have to follow the rules because yes, you can get into trouble in the future. Okay, now we feel that one thing that will help you make good decisions on how you can spend the idle funds is if you know what's the purpose behind the idle program. Okay, the purpose of the idle program is to help your business keep operating during a disaster. It is meant to help you carry you through a disaster and keep your business afloat. The idle program is not designed to make your business grow or expand. So always keep in mind those two trains of thought. We feel that if you know the difference between, is this expense helping me keep my business going, or is this expense helping me grow and expand? We feel that if you know that difference, it'll help you make good decisions on how to spend the idle loans for. Okay. Now, if you go to the SBA website, this is the information they provide. There's specifically two questions on the website regarding on how to use the idle funds for. This is directly from the SBA website, and we wanted you to see exactly what the SBA website says. Now, the first questions that is in the SBA website is, are there certain things that should be paid with economic injury loan? The answer is idle program loan proceeds may be used as working capital. This is very important to remember, working capital to pay expenses such as payroll, accounts payable, rent, mortgage, vehicle leases, and other bills that would not have been able to be paid if not for the COVID-19 disaster. Okay. Second question is, are there strict parameters with the idle as they are with PPP? For example, can I use the idle to pay my business credit card balance? The answer is the idle funds are for working capital. Again, this is a very important term, to pay ordinary and necessary debts and obligations. Funds cannot be used to expand or improve the business or refinance existing debt. However, if credit cards were used for working capital needs on an emergency basis, they can use the idle proceeds to pay the portion of their credit card that was used for emergency purposes as a result of the disaster. So yes, you can use the funds to pay the credit cards, but there are some stipulations, and we will discuss the specific cases on the credit cards uh, further along in this video. Okay. Now, remember the term working capital. In both cases, the SBA mentioned you can use the funds for working capital. Now, depending on the industry, working capital has different definitions. But in the eyes of the SBA, working capital means operational expenses. And what are operational expenses? They are costs. Remember this, you will not get into trouble. Remember, the SBA wants you to use the idle funds for operational expenses, meaning the cost of keeping your business running. So it doesn't mean expanding or growing. Okay. Now, here are the most common operational expenses in any business. And once again, these are business operational expenses because all of these expenses have to be under the business name. Okay. If you're self employed, all these expenses need to be related with your business that you provide as a self employed individual. Okay. Always remember this. These are expenses related to the business. So the most common operational expenses are accounting, advertising and marketing, insurance, legal fees, license fees, office supplies. Now we are going to give some details because there are some stipulations on office supplies, okay? Maintenance and repairs, which in this case you also have to be careful with idle, and we will go into detail further in this video as well. Rent, payroll and wages, and again you can use it for payroll and wages, but there are some limitations, and we will discuss that later in the video. Taxes, you can pay taxes with the idle loan, and again with stipulations. Travel, utilities, meaning energy, light, water, telephone, internet, all those are considered utilities for the business, remember, not personal expenses. And also vehicle expenses, which there are also some limits on vehicle expenses, which we will discuss later on. But these are the most common operational expenses you can use the idle funds for. And if you see these operational expenses, these are regular operational expenses that most businesses have in order to keep their business running. Okay? Now, the idle rules, the SBA does have a list of things you cannot use the idle funds for. Okay, we will go into detail in each on that SBA list, but after we go through the list, we will also discuss very important scenarios where you can use the idle funds to pay off your credit card and buy equipment, because that is one of the most common questions we get, is how to use the idle funds for credit card bills and equipment. So we will go through the things you cannot use the idle funds for, and later after that we will go into detail with some scenarios and exceptions where you can use the idle funds for, even though there are some rules that say you cannot use it for that purpose. Okay, so the first thing you cannot use the idle funds for is to refinance long-term debt. Now, what is long-term debt? Long-term debt is any amount of outstanding debt a business holds that has a maturity of 12 months or longer. Okay, these are usually loans. Usually business loans are 2 or 5 years, so it's longer than a year. So if you have loans, you cannot use the idle funds to refinance or pay off those long-term loans. Now, usually long-term debt is classified as non-current liabilities on the business balance sheet. So if you don't know in your business what long-term loans you have, you can take a look or ask your CPA to give you a balance sheet, and whatever is classified as non-current liability, those are your long-term debts, okay? For example, you cannot use the funds to pay off home mortgage. You cannot use the funds to pay off vehicle leases or vehicle loans. If you have business loans, lines of credit, credit card debt before January 31st, and we will go into detail in that further in the video. So once again, home mortgage, vehicle leases, vehicle loans, business loans, lines of credit, credit card before January 31st, you cannot use the funds to pay off those long-term debts that your business has, okay? Now, the other thing you cannot use the idle funds for is you cannot use the idle funds for the same purposes as the PPP loan, okay? Now, if you have received idle funds and you have also received PPP funds as well, that you got both programs, okay? Until you have used all of your PPP funds, you cannot use idle funds to pay the same kind of expenses. Remember that the PPP funds, you can use it for payroll, lease, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. So you have to wait until you use all of your PPP funds in order to pay these expenses from the idle funds, okay? Now, But during this period, you can use the idle funds to pay the other operational expenses during this time, okay? For example, the insurance, the monthly leases, the marketing, the accounting, those expenses you can use while using PPP funds. But if you have PPP funds and you have not used them completely, you cannot use idle funds to pay payroll, lease, rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. You have to wait till you use the complete PPP funds in order to use idle funds to pay these expenses. You cannot basically use the PPP funds and idle funds to pay the same expenses at the same time. Now, the other thing you cannot use the idle funds for is payments of dividends, bonuses, draws, or disbursements to business owners or shareholders. Okay, this is very important because a lot of business owners think they can just pay themselves whatever they want from the idle loan, and that is not the case. The only exception to this rule, the SBA says, is unless it is services rendered by the owner. So if you're the owner of a company and you have provided services in the company, you can get paid. But if you are a passive member of a company and you are not providing services in that company, because there are certain business owners or shareholders that are not active in the business, you cannot use the idle funds to pay those passive owners. Okay, now, but if you're an active owner in your business, that you're actively working in your business, you can pay yourself from these funds. Now, but you have to use caution. Now, we recommend not to exceed what you paid yourself in 2019. If you're a corporation or an S Corp, just pay yourself the same payroll that you paid yourself in 2019. If you're self-employed, check your 2019 Schedule C, and on line 31, that is what the government considers your annual wage, okay? Then you can just divide that by 12, and that'll give you your average monthly wages, and just pay yourself that same amount from the idle loan. For example, if you're self-employed, okay, if you take a look at your Schedule C on line 31, if it says $60,000, if we divide $60,000 by 12, that's $5,000 a month. So from the idle funds, if you're actively working in the business, you can pay yourself $5,000 a month from the idle loans, okay? But if you're a corporation or an S Corp, then if you're an active owner, you should be in payroll, just pay yourself the same payroll as 2019. Once again, we are very conservative in our tax strategies. This is what we recommend, but consult with your CPA and your attorney because they know your specific case. Now, one of the other things you cannot use your idle funds for is for payment of any other federal debt. For example, you can have federal debt with the SBA. If you have other SBA loans, you cannot pay that other SBA loan with this idle loan, okay? The only federal debt you can use the idle for is for IRS tax payments. Once again, IRS tax payments, not state tax payments. It has to be IRS tax payments. So basically, you can pay the IRS your back taxes with the idle funds, okay? Now, another thing you cannot use the idle funds for is to pay penalties and fines. If you get into trouble with any state or local or federal agency and they give you a fine or a penalty, you cannot use the idle funds to pay these penalties. For example, if you get driving tickets, or if you get OSHA penalties, state or county fines, for example, uh, restaurants may get fines from the health department. Those fines you cannot pay with the idle funds. Also, wage and hour violations. There are many employment rules at the state or federal level that if you don't pay or follow these payroll rules, you can get a penalty from the state or from the federal government. So these penalties and fines you cannot pay with the idle funds. Okay. Another thing that you cannot use the idle funds for is for investments. And a lot of we here in our accounting firm, we do the accounting for many real estate investors, and they got very sad when we told them this. Basically, you cannot use the idle funds for any kind of investment, meaning you cannot use it to buy real estate. You cannot use it to buy stocks, bonds, mutual funds. If you're a day trader, you cannot use the funds for exchange trade funds. You cannot use the funds for buying cryptocurrency, artwork, jewelry, retirement plans, annuities. All these are examples of investments that you cannot use the idle funds for. And especially real estate. We have heard many cases where people call for a consultation and they already use the funds to buy a home, and you can't do that. Okay, so you need to be very careful. Now, you cannot use the funds for relocation or expansion of facilities. Remember, this idle program is to keep your business afloat. It is not intended to make your business grow. So you cannot relocate or expand the offices. For example, you cannot use the funds to relocate your business. The federal government wants your local area to stay productive. These rules were basically established in disasters. The SBA doesn't want your business in Florida to then move to somewhere else, let's say Louisiana, because in Louisiana there's less COVID-19. Okay, you cannot relocate your business. Now, you can always call the SBA and ask for permission. Okay, you can relocate your business, but you need to ask for SBA approval first. Okay, now you cannot use the funds to expand your business. For example, you cannot use the funds to remodel the office, to make your office bigger, to move into a bigger location. You cannot use the funds for that. But we believe that if you started the expansion before the pandemic started, and if you can show that you had signed contracts before the pandemic, you can use the funds for expansion, okay? So meaning that if you already had started your expansion plan before January 31st, and if you have proof that you had already signed contracts of the expansion, that you already made deals with contractors of buying equipment, all that, we believe you can use the funds for that because you have a contract that shows that you were planning to do that, or you have an obligation to do that in a contract that was signed before January 31st. Now, this is our belief, but consult with your attorney and with your CPA for your specific case. One of the other things you cannot use the idle funds for is for contractor losses. Basically, this means that if you paid a contractor and he ripped you off, let's say that you paid him and now he disappeared, you cannot use the idle funds to pay back your business or pay yourself back that lost money. Okay. Another thing you cannot use the idle funds for is repairs or replace physical damages. Now, we feel that because of the coronavirus specific details, we do not agree with this. Why? These idle programs were designed for, like say, like for hurricane and fire disasters, and this may be why they have these rules still in the EIDL program. But we feel that if you can prove that you needed to make repairs to keep your business running, we feel that'll be okay. For example, if you have a business that relies in the production of a certain item and that equipment uh, just broke, and if you don't fix it, your business cannot run. We feel that if you can prove to the SBA, look, I needed to repair this equipment in order to keep my business running, we feel that'll be okay. But once again, that's our interpretation of the law, but consult your attorney and your CPA for your specific case. Another thing you cannot use the idle funds for is for lost profits. What does this mean? For example, let's say your business used to make $100,000 a month in sales, but because of the pandemic, now your business is only making $70,000 a month in sales. But with $70,000 in sales a month, you can cover your operating expenses. You cannot take the remaining $30,000 to make up to get the lost profits. Okay, so that's another way you cannot use the idle funds for. Now, this is where a lot of people have many questions. Is you cannot use the idle funds to acquire fixed or tangible assets. Okay, now what are fixed or tangible assets? They're assets that are purchased for long-term use and that are not likely to be quickly converted into cash. Meaning, for example, if you buy a building, usually you buy it now and you sell it in the long term. So that asset becomes cash further down the road. So it is not quickly converted into cash. Okay. They're normally used in the production of goods and services. Okay. Now, normally these assets are depreciated over time in your tax return. So if you want to know what are your current fixed assets, you can just take a look at your corporate tax return. There's a form with depreciation, and whatever's there on the depreciation form, those are your fixed assets. Now, some examples of fixed assets are vehicles, like company cars, trucks, trailers, forklift. You cannot use the funds for that. Machinery typically refers to production machinery. Okay. You cannot use the funds to buy building, land, or even the cost of construction in process. So you cannot buy basically real estate with the idle funds. Computer equipment like servers and computers. Now, we will give an example later in the video where we feel there are exceptions on buying computer equipment and other type of equipment. Another fixed asset are computer software. Usually includes the most expensive types of software. All others are charged to expense as incurred. For example, if you're paying Microsoft Office, that's not computer software. Basically, any type of software that's normally over $2,000, normally that's the rule of turning it into a fixed and tangible asset. Furniture and fixtures, you cannot use the idle funds for that, like for office tables, chairs, filing cabinets, cubicle walls. You cannot use the funds for that. You cannot use the funds for costs of patents, radio licenses, and copyrights. So these are all examples of fixed and tangible assets that you cannot use the idle funds for. Leasehold improvements. the cost incurred to renovate a leased space, office equipment like copiers or similar administrative equipment. All these are fixed assets that you cannot use the idle funds for. Okay. Now, once again, we will discuss later in the video exceptions where you can buy fixed assets, but the general rule is you cannot use them to acquire fixed or tangible assets. Okay. Now, even though these are the expenses you cannot use the idle funds for, remember that if you are still making sales, you can use your funds that you're making in your business to pay all those expenses that you cannot use the idle funds for. If you are still making sales, you can use those funds to pay all those expenses you cannot use the idle funds for. That's why it's good to have the idle funds in a separate bank account. So that means you have the bank account for your idle funds and you have your regular operational account. From the idle funds, only pay the expenses you can use it for. If you need to pay some expenses that fall into the category of the ones you cannot use the idle funds for, you can use your regular operational account that is making sales in order to acquire those assets and pay off those expenses that you cannot use for the idle funds for. Okay. Now, let's go into some exceptions because a lot of people, some of the persons we have consulted, these are the most common questions regarding equipment. Okay, so when can you use idle funds to acquire equipment? If you need to have equipment in order to keep your business running, you can also rent equipment. If you rent equipment to do a specific job, you can use the idle funds to rent the equipment. Now, if your equipment is broken, meaning that it's not repairable, and if you can prove that without this equipment, your business cannot run, we feel you can use the idle funds to repair this equipment, even though the rule says you cannot use the idle funds for repairs. We really think that if you can prove to the SBA, I needed to repair this equipment in order to keep my business running, I think we feel it'll be okay. Now, once again, documentation is going to be very important, okay? Because you need to show the SBA in case of the audit, what's your case and why did you spend the funds in repairs, okay? Also, you can lease equipment, okay? You cannot pay the equipment with the idle funds, but if you lease the equipment, that monthly lease payment becomes an operational expense and you can use the funds to make those monthly lease payments. You cannot the thing you cannot do is pay the lease off of the lease of the equipment. Okay. Also, if you already signed a contract to get equipment before the pandemic, for example, if you already made a contract with your supplier before January 31st that you were going to buy equipment, or if you can show that you had a purchase order before the pandemic or an invoice before the pandemic, but that invoice was going to be paid later on. If you have a contract to get equipment before the pandemic, we feel that you can use the idle funds to pay off that equipment. But once again, documentation is going to be key in order to prove to the SBA that you had those contracts before January 31st. Okay. Now, other exemptions regarding office equipment and supplies. Okay, so when can you use your idle funds to acquire office equipment and supplies? For example, we feel that if you had to hire an employee and you need to buy a desk, computer, chairs because your business is growing on its own meaning that you are not using the idle funds to make it grow, you are using it to keep up with the growth, then we feel you can use the idle funds to buy the desk, the computer, the equipment for that specific employee. But once again, that's our interpretation. Consult with your attorney and with your CPA. Now, credit cards. This is one of the things people ask the most. How can I use the idle funds to pay down credit cards? Okay. Yes, you can use the idle funds to pay credit card, but there are stipulations, meaning the credit card must be a business credit card. Okay. If you are a corporation, an S Corp, an LLC, the credit card has to be under the business name. It cannot be a personal credit card. If you're self-employed, okay, it must be a separate credit card that is used for business expenses only. So there cannot be a credit card where you mix personal and business expenses. Now, if you're self-employed and you only have one credit card and you use it for personal and business, then you can only use the idle funds for the business portion of the credit card bill. Now, in order to achieve that, you will need to have very good records to be able to prove the business expenses portion of that credit card bill that is mixed with your personal expenses. Now, the same idle guidelines apply for the credit card. What does that mean? Remember, for example, you cannot use the idle funds to buy a vehicle. You cannot buy the vehicle with the credit card and then pay off the credit card. So the same rules of expenses apply for credit card. Okay. If you have credit card debt, you can pay off that credit card debt if the debt was incurred after January 31st. So the credit card debt that you have from January 31st forward, you can pay with the idle funds. But if you have credit card debt that is before January 31st, you cannot use the idle funds to pay that part of the credit card bill. Okay. Now you can make your regular credit card bill payments. Okay. But you cannot just pay off your credit card debt, especially if incurred before January 31st of 2020. Okay. Now, let's give some idle tips. Okay. Once again, there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of exceptions. We feel that if you ask yourself these questions, it'll help you make good decisions. For example, if you ask yourself, am I paying this to keep my business afloat? If the answer is yes, then most likely you can use it with the idle funds. If you're asking yourself, am I paying this to make my business grow or expand? If the answer is yes, most probably you cannot pay that expense with the idle funds. Now, once again, this is our general recommendation. Each case is different, so consult with your attorney or your CPA. Our current client, our active clients, we are telling them, look, if you don't know if you can use the idle funds for a specific expense, just ask us. So it is always a good idea to ask your attorney or your CPA before buying an expense with the idle funds. Okay. Other idle tips is to place the funds in a separate bank account. Why? Because you are going to be required to send financial statements to the SBA to show them what you have used your idle funds for. So it's a lot more transparent, a lot more clear if the idle funds are in a separate bank account that is not mixed with your regular operational account, and just use that account to pay the eligible idle funds or expenses from there. Okay, use the funds for eligible expenses. And remember, it's for business purposes only. Don't mix personal expenses and business expenses. Especially don't pay personal expenses with the idle funds. Now remember that even though there's a lot of rules on what you cannot use the idle funds for, if you're still making sales, you can use your funds to pay those expenses that you cannot pay with the idle funds. Okay? We always advise our clients to plan as if you were going to get audited. Okay? Remember that if in a case of an SBA audit, you or your CPA will need to convince an auditor on why you use those funds for. So very plan for that, just in case it happens. It's very important to keep good documentation, keep receipts, keep invoices. The SBA says it can audit for 5 years back, but that's the SBA. The IRS can audit 7 years back. And we always recommend our clients for receipts and invoices to keep a digital folder. Why? To take pictures or scan the receipts, because receipts tend to fade. And it's always better to have a digital copy of the invoices and receipts. Okay. Now, a reminder that even though this idle program has a lot of rules and a lot of restrictions, it is still a very good commercial loan. It's a 30-year loan with a low monthly payment, 3.75% interest, that any commercial loan out there is between 8 and 11%. So 3.75% is a very good rate. And if you are a nonprofit, the rate is 2.75%. It's a very good loan. So if you follow the rules, this is a very good deal. Okay. Now this video is just about how you can use the idle loans for, but we also recommend that you see our video on the terms and conditions, because the SBA also has further requirements if you get the idle loan, and we discuss that in detail in that video. Okay, so thank you. If you feel we have provided value in this video, please like this video so other business owners can take advantage of this information as well. Remember that we are praying for you. We're praying for your family. We're praying for your business. We have nothing to fear because God is with us. Okay. This is our contact information. We are providing consultations. We have lowered our consultation rates in order to be able to help more business owners. So once again, if you feel this has been of value to you, like this video, and also remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you keep current with the most up-to-date information according to these loans. Okay. Once again, thank you and God bless you.